Oh my goodness. This is so much fun, you guys. This is my very first time at Plywood, and I am so excited about all of the energy and ideas that have been flowing since I got here. We've heard so many amazing ideas from people who've been presenting on stage. I've been meeting so many people just kind of side stage, backstage, in the lobby, at the after party last night, who have amazing ideas. And it gets me really excited because I am made of ideas. I feel like ideas are constantly just flowing through my brain to the point where a year ago, I actually got the opportunity to hire my very first employee. And her name is Katie. And Katie's job is specifically to tell me no to 99.9% of my ideas. Because that's the only way that I figured I would be able to accomplish like a small percentage of these ideas. And so I still remember the very first meeting that I walked into with Katie. I said, Katie, I have this amazing idea that you should totally say yes to. There's no problems with it. What if in 2017 we start a newspaper? And it'll be a real newspaper, and it'll be physical, and we'll mail it out to people, and it'll be called the Goodnewspaper. And Katie goes, Branden, we cannot do this. This is not going to work. And I think that she understandably had some good reservations, because it's 2017 and I've never bought a newspaper in my life. Like, why am I going to get other people to buy this newspaper? But I start to slowly break Katie down. I start begging her, saying, I think we can make this happen. And so today, I'm going to share the story of how I created the Goodnewspaper. But I know what you guys are thinking. Somebody who creates something called the Goodnewspaper is probably an outrageous optimist to like an unhealthy perspective. And that might be true. But today, I'm going to be telling the story of how I went from being the most optimistic person that I know to kind of hitting a wall and becoming deeply cynical. And then how I climbed my way back up to a more authentic form of optimism. And how each of us, in this time that feels like there is more bad news than ever, can experience this genuine form of optimism as well. And so let's take a quick trip through my life up until where we are today. This is my life. Let's zoom in on that first photo really quick. So this is me. Ironically enough, my very first job was delivering the news. I lived in this small little hometown, and every day I would walk home from school, I would start rolling newspapers, and I would deliver them to my neighbors. It was a really fun job. I'm really thankful for the community that I grew up in. It was a really fun spot to thrive. My next job was actually, I got started running my own business at the age of 16. For some reason, people decided to start paying me to shoot photos, and I became a professional photographer. I think that it was kind of dumb that they did that. My photos were not good at 16, but living in a small town allotted me that experience, and I'm so thankful for that. And it got me dreaming about what my life could look like in the future. What could I be doing that's entrepreneurial and creative down the road? And as I started dreaming about that, I started thinking, what can I do after high school? And I love new experiences, and so I wanted to try moving to somewhere that was completely the opposite of the small, conservative, rural hometown that I'd grown up in. So I moved to Portland, Oregon, which is amazing. I traded in that ridiculously deep V-neck for like a rain jacket. And in Portland, I really started to kind of become passionate about not just shooting weddings and portraits, though I loved that aspect of the photography world that I worked in. I started to work as a humanitarian photographer, working with nonprofits and socially conscious brands to help them tell stories all around the world. And during all this time, I was sharing these stories on my Instagram and my Snapchat and my Twitter. And as I did that, I started to develop this amazing community who believed in the same things that I believed in and who were passionate about the same things that I was passionate about. And this was a really, really fun experience. In fact, I actually, a few years ago, was nominated for Snapchatter of the Year for a Shorty Award. I did not win Snapchatter of the Year. I lost it to DJ Khaled. And if you're going to lose it to anybody, like that's the person to lose it to. And so a few years ago, I got married to my wonderful wife, Sammy. She's the love of my life. And imagine trying to explain to your future father-in-law that you are a professional Snapchatter. Like, that does not work super well, but I made it happen. Father-in-law talks aside, my life was really, really great. I had this amazing community. I had a job that I was passionate about. I had been privileged enough, and my family had been privileged enough to never really have anything bad happen in our lives. We'd never really had a significant death in our family. Nobody was really struggling with anything. We always had enough money. And again, I was living the life in Portland. And then I hit a wall. I kind of, things started to happen in my personal life and the world around me. My little brother, I got this text from my mom one day saying that they were taking my little brother to the hospital. This is actually the first time I've shared this publicly out loud. He had cut himself. And we discovered that day that he had been struggling with self-harm, and he had developed OCD, among other different mental health issues. And so I was left trying to figure out, what does this mean for me and my family, whose life has always been perfect, and to experience my brother, who's 10 years younger than me, he's just a teenager, struggling with this thing that I'd never experienced before. It was really heavy. And then at the same time, my wife started struggling with anxiety and depression. And so a lot of our days looked like this in our house. And I couldn't just be my full optimistic self at home because I don't think that's what it was needed. And so my wife and I started figuring out, what does it look like to be, in a relationship in the midst of, struggles with mental health. And on top of this, I'm still traveling around the world as a humanitarian photographer, and I feel like the stories that I was telling just got heavier and heavier and heavier. This is a woman that I met in Uganda in a village, and several years ago, the LRA came through her village, and they raped her, they killed her husband, and they took her kids as child soldiers. And she was one of dozens of people in the village, and hundreds of people that I met who had experienced this same thing. And I was wrestling with all of this injustice in my firsthand experience for the very first time. And on top of that, I think that we all kind of collectively experienced the overwhelming bad news of 2016 and 2017. I felt like I was seeing this systematic oppression of people of color up close, and I was becoming more and more aware of it. It felt like there was a new police shooting every single week. The global refugee crisis was kind of continuing to grow, and hundreds and millions of people were fleeing war and conflict in their neighborhoods that they used to call home, and then they couldn't find homes. And then it felt like terrorism globally was on the rise, and the political election divided us more than ever, both in the United States and abroad. And I was just left empty. I didn't really have the capacity to do the things that I once was able to do. The stories I was telling, the creativity that I was pursuing, I didn't have the ability to do those things to the fullest extent that I used to be able to. My family life, it felt so much harder to be hopeful and optimistic around my family with all of this happening, and I wasn't able to invest in the people around me. I built this huge community on social media, and for those of you who followed me years ago, there was a time where I was seldom posting just because I felt so overwhelmed. All of this was freezing me. I wasn't able to actually take action on anything because I was so overwhelmed. And I think that a lot of us experience this. And so it led me to this question. How do we process the injustices in the world? How can I process these injustices in the world? Because for the first time, I'd really had to do this. And I realized that most of us either do one of two things. We either ignore everything and remain optimistic, or we become obsessive and cynical. And I had been the former, and I had moved to the latter. And I didn't really want to do either one of these. And so if I was hopeful about one thing, it was that I was hopeful about the fact that there might be a third way. There might be a third option. And so I asked myself the question, what if there's a way to resist ignorance and cynicism? And so I started to dive into this. This sent me on a quest. And I can say that I believe I've come out on the other side, and I think that I've found the keys to resisting ignorance and cynicism. And so today I want to talk about those things, and let's dive into it. So the first key to resisting ignorance and cynicism is to celebrate good news. The reality is, I think we all wake up, especially this Plywood community, and we realize that there is a lot of good in the world. We just saw 4 brilliant women on stage who have the most incredible, passionate ideas on how to make the world a better place. And Jeff said something like 65 other people applied. And I have no doubt that there are so many more people in this room with incredible ideas. Like, we know that there is not a shortage of good. Most of the interactions we've had today have been positive interactions. Most of the interactions we have on a day-to-day basis are positive. Most of the people we know are good people. And I would venture to say that most of the people in the world are good people. On top of that, the number of people living in extreme poverty in the United States has plummeted since the 1970s. For the first time in history, more than half of all people who have HIV are getting treatment. They're getting the medicine that they need, and it's working. They're living the same amount of time as people without HIV. It's unreal. This was one of the biggest killers just years ago. And crime rates, this is kind of surprising to a lot of people, but crime rates have actually fallen significantly since the early 1990s, and they just continue to drop year after year. The world is a good place. There's a lot of good in the world. But why is it that when we wake up in the morning, we feel overwhelmed? We don't feel overwhelmed by the bad news. We feel overwhelmed by the things in our lives. We feel overwhelmed by the little things. And so I wanted to study the science of good and bad news. And so I talked to this guy. He's this neuroscientist. His name is Dr. Rick Hansen. And he studies the science of happiness and its effects on the brain. And he's way too smart for me. But I got a chance to have some conversations with him. And here's what he said. He said that our brains have a built-in negativity bias. Bad news sticks to our brains like Velcro, and good news slides right off our brains like Teflon. And this makes sense. If you think back thousands of years ago, you're hanging out, you're walking around, you're like a caveman or something, and all of a sudden you get attacked by a saber-toothed tiger. I don't know if those coexist, whatever. You get away from the saber-toothed tiger, but your brain definitely catalogs that as bad news, clearly. Like, that would be definitely bad news. And it holds on to that information because it doesn't want you to ever get attacked by a saber-toothed tiger again. You want to learn from your mistakes. That's bad news. Good news, on the other hand, let's say that you're hanging out, also caveman times, and you're walking through the forest, I don't know, and you grab a really piece of tasty fruit and you eat it and you're like, this is tasty. Your brain's like, this is good news. The thing is, if you don't eat that tasty fruit tomorrow, if you just eat something bland, you're going to live just fine. So you don't need that logged in your brain because your survival doesn't rely on it. And if you fast forward thousands of years, our brain's still working the exact same way. And unfortunately, advertisers know this, and the media knows this, and they prey on this because it works. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story, that's not the end of the story. The reality is that though bad news sticks to our brains more easily, we can keep good news in that same little department of our brains. We just have to work a little bit harder. Scientists say that all it takes is 15 seconds of meditating on good things for it to actually stick in your brain. And so I do this in all kinds of ways. Mostly, what I do is when I have a positive interaction, if I have a great conversation with somebody, or if I see something happen on the street, or I read a good news story, I actually pull out a notebook, or I pull out my phone, and I write it down. It takes like 15 seconds, and that's all it takes. Think about all the negative interactions you've had today and the positive interactions. The fact that maybe you forgot to put on deodorant this morning, or the fact that the person next to you forgot to put on deodorant this morning. Those things are going to stick in your brain far easier than all of the incredible talks we've seen on this stage, all the conversations you've had. So take a minute today, breathe in, 15 seconds, just think about this. Do this sometime today because it'll actually help it stick with your brain. Celebrating good news is important. Second thing is become good news. We've got celebrate good news, we've got become good news. I was really interested when I was learning all this sciencey stuff about, how, like, this whole thing about people having this internal negativity bias. And so I decided that I was going to start having conversations with people who I thought were defying this rule somehow. I knew all these people in the world who were resisting this internal negativity bias, and I was curious. And so every single week on my podcast, Sounds Good with Branden Harvey, I would have a conversation with somebody who seem to be doing this. And we've had 70-plus conversations. These are a few people that you might recognize. And I wish I could dive into every single story right now. But the one thing that all of these people have in common is that when they saw injustices in the world, when they saw pain and heartbreak and brokenness, they decided to do something about it. They could have kind of just climbed back into their hole and remained ignorant and happy and optimistic, or they could have moved over to the side of cynicism. But instead, they decided to take action, and they used their passions and abilities and talents to do this in a way that's unique to them. And this was a really, really interesting thing to think about. And so in the midst of this, I started to dive into this question of, so ultimately what this comes down to is how to not be frozen by bad news. You celebrate good news and you become good news. Celebrating good news reminds you that there is still hope. And becoming part of the solution reminds you that you are not powerless. And let's take this down to an example. This is one of the most heartbreaking moments that I can remember in the last 2 years, at least in the United States. We all remember when a gunman walked into a nightclub in Orlando, and it became the largest mass shooting in American history. Absolutely heartbreaking. I remember being in Oregon and being glued to the television, glued to the internet for like 48 hours. Just hitting refresh on New York Times, waiting for more news to come in. And in the midst of that, somehow I stumbled across some stories of people who were responding to this, who were actually taking action because of this heartbreaking moment. And I was curious, are there more people who are becoming good in this terrible, awful situation? And so I started to dive into it. And did you guys know that a war veteran saved dozens of people during the shooting? 60-plus people is actually the number. He put his life on the line and saved 60 people's lives. Could have been double the casualties. A crowdfunding campaign raised $2 million in a single day. This is people all around the world, all around the country, saying, hey, I'm going to do something. One person took off their own shirt, saved a bartender's life by applying it to a wound. And people within hours, they lined up around the block to donate their blood. So many people actually showed up that they had to turn people away, and they scheduled people for future weeks. Like, that's incredible. This is such good news. And what was really cool is by actually celebrating this news, by putting it out there, you saw more and more people joining in. You saw more people show up to donate blood. And a lot of people who weren't in Orlando, they decided, hey, I'm going to do something. So they started donating money online. Or they were so inspired that when some sort of traumatic event happened in their lives, inevitably, in their community and the people around them, they decided to take action in a unique way in their community. And so during this whole time, I started to learn all about how to do this, how to celebrate good news and become good news, to actually look for the things being done in the world that worked, and then to become a part of those things. And all of a sudden, I felt less overwhelmed. I felt less frozen. I actually had the ability to join in and take action. But I looked around at the people around me, and I saw that they were still struggling. And so I wanted to create a tool to help people celebrate good news and become good news. And so that's when I told Katie that we need to start the newspaper. And so we bring this thing to life. We start hustling on this. And let me tell you, this is the most terrifying experience of my life. I was sitting there getting ready to hit the publish button on Kickstarter, and I was just shaking with fear. I was thinking, who am I to be the person to bring this to life? In the months since I launched this, I've gotten 50-plus messages from people saying, I had this idea a year ago, and I never did anything about it. I had this idea 10 years ago, and I never did anything about it. I had this idea 50 years ago, and I never did anything about it. And I was thinking, who am I to be the person to bring this idea to life? Why am I allowed to take this idea and hit the publish button? But I believe that creativity, it connects us all. And when you're given an idea, if you pass on it, that idea might get passed on to somebody else because maybe it needs to be out in the world. And so I decided to hit the publish button because I didn't want to regret not doing this one day. So I hit the publish button, and I was so nervous. Most nervous I've ever been to press a button on the internet. I don't know what's going on. But I didn't have to be nervous for long because 52 hours later, we were fully funded on Kickstarter. Yeah, it was amazing. Hundreds of people had rallied together around this idea. We were blown away. And within 30 days, we had more than doubled our campaign goal. And hundreds of people had joined our community. So I want to give a quick breakdown of how we do this. Inside the newspaper, you guys have all got one, which well done, Plywood, for giving everybody a newspaper. I'm blown away. But inside the paper, we've got long articles, short articles. All of them are celebrating the good in the world. Did you guys know that the suicide rate among high schoolers is falling? Or that China is going to outlaw the ivory trade by the end of 2017? Or that Malawi's AIDS rate is dropping at a record rate? Like, this is all such good news. And the cool thing about actually holding onto a newspaper and reading it versus maybe a tweet or an article or something kind of in this fast-paced digital world that we live in is it slows you down enough for this to actually get cataloged in your brain. It takes a little bit more than 15 seconds to read every article. And so these things actually stick with you differently than everything else on the internet does. And then at the bottom of every page, we want to give people the ability to get involved. So we created a little bar called the Good Bar, and we've got it broken down into good, better, best. We want to give people tangible action steps on how they can get involved in the ideas and passions that they care about, with the causes that matter to them. And so good usually means, hey, read this article, tweet this tweet, post this thing on Facebook, share this thing with a friend. It's usually just kind of an entry-level way to get people involved in a small way. And that's important. But we don't want people to stop there. So the next bar is better. We want people to donate their resources. We want people to donate their money, to get involved in that way, to help empower the people who are out there doing good work. And then we say that the best thing to do is to use your talents and abilities and passions to get involved. Not just because you're going to be really effective in doing that, because it's an all-in thing, but it actually helps you feel more connected. So it's good, better, best, and we'll get there in a second. But ultimately, we are so excited about this because hundreds of people, sorry, we've had 10,000 copies of this first issue of the newspaper printed. And we've shipped these all over the world to who knows how many countries. And it's been amazing to see people's response, the way that people have been taking action and all of a sudden not feeling frozen by the news cycle that we're in right now and actually being a part of the solution. Because there are a lot of things in the world that are worth celebrating. And there's a lot of things in the world worth becoming a part of. And during this whole time, this man right here has been my absolute hero. This guy, we all know him, Mr. Fred Rogers. And he said this. This is one of my all-time favorite quotes. He said, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.'" And so my encouragement for you today is absolutely go out and look for the helpers. Celebrate the helpers. Celebrate good news. And then let those helpers encourage you to go out and become helpers yourselves. Celebrate good news, become good news. Thank you.